I'm about to and should have Jonathan.
Not yet.
Okay. Yeah, I thought you had it still muted there. That's okay. All right.
I got you finally. Move to
Yep.
the slideshow. All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to share again in the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum. This evening, rather special because our presenter is coming to us all the way from France. And I think where we're starting at 8 o'clock. It's probably 3 o'clock in the morning for him. And so special effort on his part to be with us. And so, Jonathan Neville, thank you for making that extra effort to be here.
Happy to be here.
He has visited over 90 countries in his explorations of the world. He has a remarkable repository of arts and of memories, at least, of the arts and antiquities of mankind. And his appreciation of the Book of Mormon and his focus on the Promised Land has given him cause to present numerous times on this forum on several of his 50 plus books, and this evening on the Rational Restoration. His No More Contention site echoes the prophetic utterance of Fred M. Smith, one of the four prophets who lived in the house that your host invites you to tour. And it's a pleasure to welcome him back from France at about 3 a.m. on tomorrow, one of the most prolific writers and authorities on the Book of Mormon. It is, I'm going to introduce this evening the modes of intelligence, for we have a remarkable scripture that says that the glory of God is intelligence, in other words, light and truth. And because he's talking about the rational restoration, I'm wanting to invite him to pick up on these. I've got 9 types of intelligence in front of you here. I actually have 10 of them I put together now, but basically the first 8 were by Howard Gardner, who put them together about 1980, and I've used them in my classes trying to arrange activities so that the people with each of these different um, intelligences would be intrigued. And in history, it's been a pretty good challenge and a lot of fun. And so I'm anxious to see us put that together in such a way that instead of us all focusing upon our own individual intelligences, if we could get them consolidated, get us working together, unifying our intelligences, I think there's a remarkable repository, a synergic repository that can be pulled together. And I believe that is fundamental to the purposes of the restoration movement. So since Jonathan is so prolific, I wanted to lay this out there as a bit of bait, a stimulus to encourage him to write another book, because while he's working on the rational restoration, the intelligences of the restoration, I believe, should be forthcoming. But let us pray together. Creator of the multiverse, with its rational intricacy, we bow in respect, in honor for your quest for our attention and our intimacy. For you, who glory in intelligence and its awesome creative ways, inspire us to seek to develop our own intelligence and reasoning and use it all our days. Yet we find our intelligences disparate. Some learning by listening, some are visual, some by touch, kinesthetic. And we often miscommunicate, focused upon our own aesthetic. Some have social genius, some in math or science. Some study best by looking deeply within, and some make music or have agility upon which they have reliance. And some think existentially, seeking ties between history and its future. And then we see artificial intelligence as an augmentation to mother's nurture. How wonderful, dear Lord of heaven, of earth, and of us all, if we could integrate our intelligences together to glorify you in answer to your call. For us to be your people, followers of the Prince of Peace, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Right.
All right, Jonathan, I'm delighted to welcome you back to the forum and all of the friends that decided to join us as well. And there's some I did not get yet to greet. I see Phyllis Weaver on and Lynn Lee, Brent. Everyone, welcome to tonight. Jonathan, I'm not clear whether you want to invite people to interrupt you or if you prefer to present all the way and then take the questions afterwards.
I'm fine either way. You know, I try to I'm trying to respond to what people are interested in. So if people have questions, I'm happy to do that at any point. Hopefully I can tell if you're raising your hand, but I'm sure feel free to interrupt me anytime, no problem.
Well, we don't have Deb. We have Robert myself to
Okay.
moderate on that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, it's yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was a fantastic introduction. I'd like to have you send me those slides of the different types of intelligence because I am really interested in that. And it made me think of what Moroni said about all the different gifts of the Spirit. You know, everybody has different ways of learning. And certainly each one of us has different gifts and interests and talents and abilities. So I like to see them all integrated as well. So I don't know about writing another book about that. My wife keeps telling me, stop writing books, you know, but anyway, so I do still do some blogging. Well, let me get into this a little bit. I'll start it and then I'll explain kind of what we're doing. So I'll share my screen here. This should be the right one. Okay. So you should be able to see that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the name of the book. I think, you know, Paul, I couldn't remember. It seems like I talked about the book somewhat a year or two ago, but I have a lot of different things to talk about tonight. And part of it is that I actually have a second edition out, which you can see from the cover here is kind of a space theme. And that one is only right now is only available on Kindle. But I made some changes and added some additional material. We're translating it into French. So there's a lot going on right now with it. But this is basically the idea that I focus on clarity, charity, and understanding, which we'll discuss this evening a little bit. And the idea is that the restoration is rational, but you'll see why here. But I thought I'd start off by explaining a little bit about France and what we're doing here and why. This is a picture of Lyon on the left, and then on the right is a picture from the local park. There's a big park here down the street from where our apartment is. We're right in downtown Lyon. And it's an amazing park. I'll show you some pictures from that too. But so the other day we were down in southern France in Provence where the lavender is thriving right now. You can see a couple pictures on the left there. They even have lavender ice cream, which was delicious. That little
Oh,
purple
wow.
ice cream there. And it tastes just like lavender smells. So they have lots of sunflowers right now. The sunflowers are all over in France and these massive fields full of sunflowers. And then you can see in the upper right, there's a couple of giraffes there and the people looking at it. That's in our park. They have a zoo that's just open to the public. It doesn't cost anything. We have zebras and giraffes, and you can see some flamingos there and lots of other animals. Of course, you just walk around and they're just in the park. And then in the lower right corner, I showed you a golf course in this little town that we live in, also separate from Lyon. It's called Rodez. And it's hard to see the background in that picture, so I expanded it a little bit. And you can see on the top of the hill, there's a chapel. It's not a chapel, it's a cathedral, actually. It's in the background of that golf picture, too. But it stands prominently on top of that hill, as do so many churches and cathedrals here in France. The next couple pictures are just to give you an idea of some of the sites that we've seen since we've been here. I've taken hundreds of pictures, well, actually thousands, because Paul, you know, I'm an artist too. And so once in a while I have some time here to do some artwork. I might show you a couple pieces if you want later, but So I take lots of pictures as inspiration for the artwork, but these are just a few of the scenes in France that we've seen recently. And then, of course, there are the massive and spectacular cathedrals that we have all over. And there's two here in Rodez and Albi are two cities that not many tourists go to, but they have two of the most spectacular and largest cathedrals in all of France and all of Europe, actually. One of them is the one on the left there is in Albi, and it's actually made of brick. Unlike most cathedrals are big stones, granite stones or sandstone or other stones. It's made of brick, and they say it's the largest brick structure in the world. I could do a whole presentation on the cathedrals sometime if you want, but that's just to give you a feel for what it's like. Now, all of this makes me think of the Book of Mormon, which says, "Moreover, I say to you that the time shall come and the knowledge of a Savior shall spread throughout every nation, kindred, tongue, and people." And that's what we're seeing. Of course, the Book of Mormon has been translated into many languages. In fact, here in France and in Germany and Europe in general, there's a wide variety of languages. We've met people using Arabic or Turkish or Persian, French, of course, German, Italian, Luxembourgish even the other day. Spanish, you can just imagine all the different languages that we've had. But people are, as is well known from the news, people are immigrating here from all over the world, from all over Africa, all over the Middle East. And France is becoming multilingual even more than the European languages. So it's been really interesting to see and have the Book of Mormon available to people no matter where they come from. We've been in, well, I'll explain our mission. So this is us pointing to our mission here in France. And by contrast, this was me 50 years ago here in France. So I've changed a little bit in the interim, you can tell. But so my wife and I are here, we're church history specialists. And there's a few assignments that we have. I'll just list these. We're doing oral histories of people, particularly pioneers, people who have accepted and loved the Book of Mormon for many decades. We do virtual tours of different sites, particularly sites of historic interest, chapels, and so on. We do lots of open houses. This is an example of an open house that we were. It might be hard to see in the picture there, but I brought with me some church history artifacts like a replica. These are replicas. I didn't bring originals of the 1830 Book of Mormon, Emma's first hymn book, Book of Commandments, First Doctrine and Covenants. I brought an example of the printer's manuscript in full size in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. The example of the Times and Seasons, the Messenger and Advocate. A lot of these early church history things. I even brought an example of the size of the gold plates that I show people. And you can see there a little bit in the lower left of that picture. I have a set of the Joseph and Hiram death masks that I brought over. So we show these church history artifacts to people. And of course, in France, nobody's seen any of these things before. So it's been really interesting for people to have a chance to see these artifacts. And then we're also creating a website for church history here in France specifically that has a combination of all of these things and a few other history related topics. This is just to give you an idea of what's happened, at least in the LDS church here in France. The red circle is about when I was here on my mission. There were about 10,000 LDS at the time, and now there's over 40,000. This kind of lists the same thing that I just did, I guess, but that shows you the boundaries of our particular mission, which is southern and eastern France. But we're not limited to our mission area. There's 13 stakes in France that speak French and we work with all of them. We've been up to Paris and Luxembourg, and we have Switzerland, of course, we've been to, in Germany, and we do some work down in Spain also. So we're kind of all over the place in doing these virtual tours and different firesides and open houses. This was kind of interesting that the the French Book of Mormon was actually the second foreign translation. The first was in Danish, and then in French, German, and Welsh, and it's since been retranslated in French twice, I think. And it's also interesting, this map shows where people speak French in the world. Of course, France has territories in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean, and there's lots of European or African countries where people still speak French. And many of the immigrants here are from Africa because they can speak the language very easily. So they estimate there's between 80 and 100 million native French speakers, and another roughly 220 million who speak French as a second language around the world. So that's some background on all of that. So any questions about that, feel free to jump in, but I'll just continue otherwise. Again, this is what I started off with, explaining how this book is presenting reframes in the pursuit of clarity, charity, and understanding. So that's the main emphasis here. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about what is a reframe. And the dictionary definition is to change the way something is expressed or considered. And one example of this that I thought I'd start with is Samuel Smith, because he's well known as the first missionary. Joseph said he was also a scribe at one point. And when I looked into some of his work, I didn't realize how much he'd walked, but they say he walked over 4,000 miles when he was distributing the Book of Mormon through the Midwest and New England. And that's pretty significant. That's about how many miles we've driven since we've been in France for our various assignments. That's a lot of travel, 4,000 miles. You know, they like us, one of the default health monitors that Google gives us on our phones is 6,000 steps a day, right? And so to do 4,000 miles, you're doing a lot more than 6,000 steps. A lot of days we'll do 10,000 or 15,000 steps, depending on what city we're in. But still, that's significant. And for Samuel Smith, he was really trying to present a reframe of Christianity to the world. And here's kind of one way that I kind of imagine Samuel Smith as a young missionary walking around telling everybody, it says, yes, you are all wrong, right? as that individual missionary going around trying to tell everybody about the restoration. But then I also wanted to point out that one of his missionary endeavors sent him to Boston, Massachusetts in August of 1832. And when he was there, one of the journalists asked him and his missionary companion, who I believe was Orson Hyde, questions. And the article was titled, Questions Proposed to the Mormonite Preachers. And one of the questions was, in what manner was the interpretation or translation made known, and by whom was it written? And the answer he gave was, it was made known by the Spirit of the Lord through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, and was written partly by Oliver Cowdery and partly by Martin Harris. Now, we could talk quite a bit about that particular statement because there were other scribes as well, which I assume, and Samuel was one of them, and I assume he meant that, or at least the reporter only wrote down these two because they were the principal ones. But of course, we don't know how much Martin Harris was a scribe for on the original manuscript. He doesn't appear, he was described for the 116 pages, of course, but as far as for the original manuscript, some people, some of us, I'm included among that, think he was described for part of the Book of Mosiah. But the interesting point here was, this is the earliest known mention of the Urim and Thummim in print or anywhere, actually. He went on, the next question was, they asked him, what do you mean by the Urim and Thummim? And he answered, the same as were used by the prophets of old, which were two crystal stones placed in bows, something in the form of spectacles, which were found with the plates. Now, this is, for some people in our day, this is a reframe also because of the prevalence of the idea that Joseph Smith used a seer stone in a hat instead of the Urim and Thummim. And I know there's been a time in history when historians believe that it was W.W. Phelps who coined the term Urim and Thummim because of his article in 1833 messenger and advocate. This discovery of this article in 1832 shows that Samuel Smith knew about the Urim and Thummim the year before that and talked about it in 1832. So that's had to change a lot of the historical assumptions about the origin of that term. Okay, here's another one that came up just today. Well, actually, yesterday for me on Monday. A friend of mine asked me about this term ceremony that's in Mosiah 1924 or Mosiah 9, 99 through 101. And I'll go ahead and read this in case some of you can't see it very well, but it's a passage from the Book of Mosiah that uses the term ceremony. It starts off, and it came to pass that they were about to return to the land of Nephi. This is after the people had killed King Noah and were trying to kill the priests, and they escaped. So it says, it came to pass that they were about to return to the land of Nephi, and they met the men of Gideon. And the men of Gideon told them of all that had happened to their wives and children, and that the Lamanites had granted unto them that they might possess the land by paying a tribute to the Lamanites of 1/2 of all they possessed. And the people told the men of Gideon that they had slain the king, and his priests had fled from them farther into the wilderness. And it came to pass that after they had ended the ceremony, that they returned to the land of Nephi rejoicing, because their wives and their children were not slain. And they told Gideon what they had done to the king. So that term ceremony, which is only used in this one place in all the scriptures, has caused scholars to wonder what it meant and what were they referring to. So here's some examples. Royal Skousen, he believes it was a scribal error because it could have been the word sermon, which in Old English could refer to a conversation, like one between the men of Gideon and the people who slew Noah. The original manuscript for Mosiah 19 has not survived, but a sermon may have been misspelled as sermon, C-E-R-M-O-N, and then Oliver Cowdery miscopied it into the printer's manuscript as ceremony, which is how it's actually spelled in the printer's manuscript, which is a misspelling of ceremony. So that's Royal Skousen's take on it. He's always trying to frame everything as Old English, right, or early modern English. Another one, John Tibetness, said that the ceremony was one of purification associated with the onset of the fall festivals in the month of Tishrei, at which time the citizen soldiers in the ancient Near East returned home to engage in the fall harvest. So, of course, there's nothing in the passage that refers to a harvest or the fall or anything, but his view was maybe it was a purification ceremony. John Sorensen argued that the Nephites apparently had a standard execution ceremony that accompanied executions like that of Noah, as evidenced by the ceremonial speech or actions mentioned in connection with the executions of Nahor and Zemnariah. In my view, those are what happened on those two executions was completely different. So it wasn't a standard execution ceremony. And besides, they had killed the king before they had this conversation with the people of the men of Gideon. So that didn't make sense to me, but that's an alternative. I like to talk about multiple working hypotheses. So this is an example of this. John Welch said the execution of Zemnariah was one of the most complete accounts of an execution ceremony found in any ancient record. Welch has shown that the account closely followed ancient customs of ceremony and law. After Zerahemnah was hanged from a tree, they did fell the tree to the earth. All the people who witnessed the hanging ceremonially cried out, invoking God's protection upon the people and a simile curse upon their future enemies, and they then praised and thanked God. I've pointed out, though, that really what they were celebrating was the end of the war, and the death of Zemnariah was really the conclusion of the war. So it wasn't his death they were celebrating so much as the end of the war. Brent Gardner suggested several other possibilities that were appropriate at this time, including a ceremony of greeting, perhaps a ceremony of surrender to Gideon's men, or a truce which allowed the two groups to reunite and converse safely, realizing there was no longer any hostile intent. So I don't know, hey, Paul, have you ever had a session discussing this word ceremony before?
No, we have not, and I am delighted to see this, and I think it's especially gratifying to see Gardner coming up with several options where other people generally stick on with their own preference.
Yeah. Well, now I'm going to show you mine. What do you think mine might be?
Oh, wow.
I'll show you. It's really fascinating. And this one just came up today, well, yesterday for you guys. So I point out that the text says this ceremony ended after the two groups took turns exchanging their respective news, because they were telling what had happened while they were gone. The one group had killed the king, and the other one was telling him, hey, your wives and children are fine, right? And that's exactly how Jonathan Edwards used the term.
Wow.
Here's a quotation from Jonathan Edwards. He says, when a multitude meet on any occasion of temporal rejoicing, freely and cheerfully to converse together, they are not wont to observe the ceremony of but one speaking at a time, while all the rest, in a formal manner, set themselves to attend to what he says. So, in other words, that would spoil all conversation and turn it into the formality of set speeches. So, in the context, what he was talking about was he liked to have Christians just to get together in groups and converse among themselves, what we would call a dinner party today, with small groups just all talking. And he says they aren't going to observe the ceremony of one speaking at a time and all the rest listening to what he says, which is what had just happened in the book of Mosiah. Isn't that interesting?
Wow, that is neat.
Yeah, it's cool because all this speculation about what this word means, nobody thought to see how Jonathan Edwards used it. He used it in exactly that same context.
Well, and
So
that's one of several hundred parallels that you have found, and that's just delightful.
yeah, yeah. This one I really it was funny because a friend just asked me yesterday Monday morning. He says, "What is this ceremony they're talking about?" And so I looked into it, and I was actually kind of surprised at this one because this one I was familiar with Royal Skousen's take that it was a scribal error, and as well as the other arguments from Brent Gardner and John Welch and so on. And I thought, I wonder what Edwards had to say about it. And then this popped right out, so it was cool. Just another example of how I think that Joseph Smith translated the plates and he used the correct terminology. So hopefully I know I'm in a minority among certain scholars when I say that, but to me, it's obvious that Joseph and Oliver told the truth and they explained exactly what had happened. So and this is another evidence that corroborates what Joseph and Oliver said. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the reframes. This is a quotation from my book, actually. I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, for me and many others, gospel living is simply the most rational way of life. And this really comes home to me here in France because people here, there's a lot of smoking and a lot of, let's say, non-gospel lifestyle here in France. And as correspondingly, there's a lot of contention here. There's political contention that exists everywhere. But just in the streets, people are nice to each other. They're very polite, but they argue a lot also. We can hear it because we live downtown in an apartment building, and we can hear people on the street arguing, and they're in the various apartments because everybody has their windows open. And it's just very interesting. But anyways, the gospel living is the most rational way of life. As Nephi wrote, we lived after the manner of happiness. On a daily basis, we observe the sad, preventable consequences of people making choices to live contrary to gospel principles. So the idea of this reframe, well, I'll continue that quotation. One impediment to gospel living is the perception that the truth claims of the restoration are false, or that belief in God is irrational. The reframes we discussed below offer alternatives to what seem to me to be irrational or less rational propositions advanced by critics and some apologists. To be sure, rationality depends on the worldview we start with. As we can see through the faith model, which we'll discuss that in a minute, everyone starts with the same facts. Based on facts, we can all make rational and different assumptions, draw inferences, and apply theories consistent with our worldview. So depending on how much time we have, I'll go through more examples, but I'm just going to give you one right here. So the old narrative among faithful people about the restoration is that the restoration came out of nowhere to thwart traditional Christianity. The critical view was the restoration is a product of Joseph Smith's imagination. And the reframe is that the restoration fulfills the long-held aspiration of Christians. And that's the area that I delved into with the Jonathan Edwards material, because I showed that Jonathan Edwards really anticipated the restoration and provided much of the, well, helped to prepare the world really for the restoration, at least the Christian world, if they recognized it. So this becomes meaningful, particularly here in France, because everywhere we go, here's an example, there are churches and cathedrals in every little town. Here's just a small selection of the hundreds that we've seen. And in every case, the cathedral is prominent. You always see the spire sticking up above the rest of the city. In many, even relatively small towns, there are multiple churches and cathedrals. This one on the far right is, there's a long series of steps that you walk up to get to it. It's very picturesque. In fact, I've done a painting of this one. And it's you basically have to go on a pilgrimage to reach this little church. There's several pilgrimages throughout southern France that people go on in the summer. We've encountered many pilgrims on various pilgrimage routes. And so there's a long history of Christianity. Of course, the popes were in Avignon for many years, and there's lots of traditions about how Christianity was spread here in France. In fact, even here in Lyon is one of the earliest Christian churches in the world. And so it's very interesting to see how pervasive and persistent Christianity has been here. Of course, some of these cathedrals have been here for over 1,000 years. So the reframe, though, on the restoration, at least from my perspective, are all these chapels now that exist in France. These are just a few that we've taken pictures of to do these virtual tours. When I was here 50 years ago, there were 2 chapels. There was one in Versailles and one in Bordeaux, I believe. Maybe there was probably one in Geneva. I don't remember that one, but now they're all over the place, chapels like this. And it's interesting to see the contrast, because many of the traditional chapels, like the ones I just showed, are either in complete disuse or rarely used anymore. And that's because a large percentage of the population is no longer believing Christian. These chapels are all, obviously they're newer, so they're being used, but it's an interesting comparison. So I like to talk about the Book of Mormon as has created a worldwide community of faithful disciples of Christ. And this is a photo from the first edition at Dartmouth College. Maybe some of you have seen that one. It's not, you can go to the desk there at Dartmouth and ask to see it, and they'll bring it out and let you flip through the first edition. And it'd be fun to talk about that at some point. There's an index in there that was added later. Lots of cool details about that particular edition. But the Book of Mormon really has created a worldwide community of disciples of Christ, and it continues to grow. Paul mentioned earlier that we've traveled a lot. These are some of the places where my wife and I have attended church meetings or a temple around the world. And you can see that there's quite a worldwide community there. The blue are the countries that we visited so far. I don't know if it's updated, but okay. And these are some of the people we've met around the world, all faithful disciples of Christ brought together because of the Book of Mormon. This is from an older presentation I did, but that red circle that popped up shows the 2 of us in the back. This was at a meeting in Laos, and it was the first Sunday of the year that year, and they were taking a picture of everyone, and they insisted that we be in their branch picture there. So that was kind of different. Okay, so I talk about clarity, charity, and understanding. So let's talk about what those 3 are. Clarity is the idea of improving perspectives on reality, and this is a comparison between the Hubble telescope and the Webb telescope. You may have seen these where you pull the line between them and you see these stark differences because the Webb has such a higher resolution. And in other words, it provides better clarity. And that's one thing that I encourage everyone to do, is to seek clarity and precision, so we all understand what we all think and believe and know. The next part is charity, and that's the idea of assuming good faith on behalf of everyone involved in a conversation. And the third is understanding, because it's more important, in my view, to understand than to persuade. And, you know, early on in my career, when I was a lawyer, of course, I had to try to persuade a judge or a jury to agree with my client's point of view. And that's part of that's our quote unquote fact-finding system that we have in our country as well as other countries. But when it comes to interpersonal relations or the various topics that we're all interested in, persuasion shouldn't be our objective, because persuasion can blind us, whereas seeking to understand one another leads to both people having a better understanding of one another. And we don't have to change our minds, but at least we understand one another better. And that's why I focus on clarity, charity, and understanding instead of any kind of persuasion or apologetics or any of that kind of stuff. That's all part, Paul, you mentioned earlier my website, No More Contention. And that's partly what led to this. How do you achieve no more contention? And it's by not trying to persuade anybody. It pretty much, I've tried to think of an example of contention that arises from something other than an attempt to persuade somebody of something. I haven't been able to come up with an example yet. It all boils down to this compulsion that we all have to try to persuade people to agree with us. Because if it wasn't for that, there wouldn't be any contention. So I try to eliminate any of that persuasion effort. It's almost an instinct we have, I guess, sometimes. Okay, so one example of this whole reframing is the one that we have talked about before here, and that is the two sets of plates. I assume by now everybody's familiar with it. Should I review it quickly, Paul, or should we just?
Go ahead and review it. I think we have a few people that are comparatively new.
Okay. Okay, so this is the idea that Joseph Smith actually translated two completely different sets of plates. And the first set of plates were the ones he got from the Moroni stone box on the hill Cumorah. And that was the abridged plates. And we know that was the abridged plates because the title page, which was the last leaf of the plates, says that's what it contained. It was an abridgment of the record of the Nephites, an abridgment of the record of the people of Jared, along with Moroni sealing it with his own account at the end. So was well, I guess that's the second box. The first box is the repository in the hill Cumorah. And, you know, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and others, and as well as David Whitmer, said that Oliver Cowdery told them about he and Joseph having entered the repository on the hill Cumorah. And that's where the brass plates were, the large plates of Nephi, the plates of Lehi, the original 24 plates of Ether, and what we call the small plates of Nephi, his original writings. These and many others were in this repository, and that's what Mormon used when he did the abridgment in the first place. That's all in, as he wrote about, he explained that. So then out of there, the red arrows show the abridged portion that Mormon wrote. And that was what Moroni put in the stone box. The abridged record of the people of Nephi, and then the abridged part of Ether, along with his Moroni's original plates and whatever the sealed portion was, which we don't have much information about. That's what was in the repository. And Joseph took those down to Harmony, and he translated the entire set of abridged plates except for the sealed portion. But when he was about to leave Harmony, well, I should back up. In our DNC 9 is when Oliver Cowdery was told by the Lord, well, you tried to translate, you weren't able to, but just finish this work, and then I have other plates or other records that you can assist to translate. The Lord didn't explain what those other records were until the next session, which is our DNC 10, when the Lord told Joseph, don't go back and retranslate the book of Lehi, the missing 116 pages. Instead, you have to translate the plates of Nephi. But Joseph didn't have those plates at that point when he was in Harmony. And that's what the arrow on the bottom shows. Because before he left Harmony, he gave the plates to what he called a divine messenger. This was the old man with the plates in the knapsack that David Whitmer described several times. And when they were on the road to Fayette from Harmony, they encountered this man on the side of the road. And David Whitmer asked him if he wanted a ride. And he said, no, I'm going to Cumorah. And that's when David said, that's the first time he ever heard the word Cumorah, which obviously he hadn't read the manuscript, so he didn't know Joseph and Oliver had just translated the word Cumorah. And he said that he asked Joseph who it was, and Joseph Smith said it was one of the three Nephites. So they continued on to Fayette, and later this messenger brought the plates of Nephi to Fayette, and that's why Joseph translated those in Fayette instead of in Harmony, which we know that from the original manuscript, because the original manuscript is in the handwriting of Oliver Cowdery, but also John and Christian Whitmer, who were never present in Harmony. So that's why our current edition of the Book of Mormon, the 1830 edition, that ours are all based on, put the small plates of Nephi at the beginning because that fit chronologically, but that was the last part that Joseph Smith actually translated. So the Book of Mormon we have today is not in the order that it was translated, but it's in chronological order. All right, so that's all a reframing. And the reason it's significant, partly because it explains those sections in the Doctrine and Covenants where the Lord said he had another record to translate and then told him to translate the plates of Nephi. But it's also significant to explain why there were discrepancies in some of the accounts. The Lapham account said that Joseph Smith Sr. weighed the plates and they weighed 30 pounds, whereas other people who hefted them earlier when Joseph had them in the box and so on said they weighed 60 pounds. And then the 8 witnesses said they handled all the plates and none of them said any portion was sealed. So there's various discrepancies like that that critics have pointed out that are explained by this scenario here. One other thing is that in his history, Joseph Smith wrote that when he was finished with the plates, he returned them to the messenger by prior arrangement. But Brigham Young said that when he was finished with the plates, he took them back to the hill Cumorah. So that's a discrepancy that is resolved here also, because Joseph did return the abridged plates to the messenger that David Whitmer met. And when he was finished with the plates of Nephi, he returned those to the repository in the hill Cumorah. So this is one of my favorite reframes because it resolves these puzzles, so to speak, that have persisted for a long time. So, okay, moving on. So why a rational restoration? I know there's one well-known church leader who, when he saw my book, he said, well, the restoration is really kind of irrational. And I said, well, yeah, you could look at it that way, but this is from this is an excerpt here from a man who heard Joseph Smith speak in Washington, D.C. So I'll read his excerpt and then I'll read his longer letter. First, he was writing to his wife, and he said, there was much in his precepts, if they were followed, that would soften the asperities of man towards man, and that would tend to make him a more rational being than he is generally found to be. And that's one of my favorite quotations that epitomizes what Joseph Smith taught us all, because his teachings do make us more rational. And sometimes we don't think of it that way, but that's what this observer's impression was. So here's his whole, an excerpt from his letter. This is when Joseph was in Washington, D.C. in February of 1840. He wrote to his wife and said, he, Joseph Smith, commenced by saying that he knew the prejudices which were abroad in the world against him, but requested us to pay no respect to the rumors which were in circulation respecting him and his doctrines, which is good advice for all of us, I think. I believe, said he, that there is a God, possessing all the attributes ascribed to him by Christians of all denominations, that he reigns over all things in heaven and on earth, and that all are subject to his power. He then spoke rationally of the attributes of divinity, such as foreknowledge, mercy, etc., etc. He then took up the Bible. I believe, said he, in this sacred volume. In it, the Mormon faith is to be found. We teach nothing but what the Bible teaches. We believe nothing but what is to be found in this book. This is the quote I just did. There was much in his precepts, if they were followed, that would soften the asperities of man towards man, and that would tend to make him a more rational being than he is generally found to be. There was no violence, no fury, no denunciation. His religion appears to be the religion of meekness, lowliness, and mild persuasion. Now there he is using persuasion, which I just said is the source of contention. But I suppose mild persuasion is a way of saying seeking understanding of one another. That's how I like to frame that one. But isn't that an awesome quotation? That's one of my favorite of all. And we have this letter. It's right in the Joseph Smith papers. Anybody can read it. But so my idea here in France and everywhere I go when I talk to people about the restoration is to emphasize that our precepts will make us all more rational. And let's see how that happens.
Jonathan, if I can intrude there,
Yeah, sure.
the idea of contention typically is pro and con, that is either or.
Mhm.
Whereas
Yeah.
if you have, as section 162 in Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenant says, reason together, what's it say? Um, reason together in love, and the
Mhm.
spirit of truth will prevail. So
Yeah.
if you can reason together in love, mild persuasion, using multiple intelligences, then you see the opportunities are synergic.
Absolutely. Perfect. Yeah, well said. That's this whole same idea of clarity, charity, and understanding, all three combined. Because as you mentioned, if you're working together in a council or something, let's say, we all assume everybody has charity for one another, that we're seeking to understand one another, and that's what allows us to have clarity. So it's those three things just are intertwined. It's awesome. Related to that is this next graphic, because this is something that some of us get distracted from one or the other, particularly by the media. There's things that matter, things you could control. We should focus on the intersection of those two, right? Because it's so easy to get caught up in things that don't matter on one hand, things we can't control on the other, and therefore I'd like to keep this in mind all the time when I have various conversations. So there's another approach to this too that relates to this idea of the rational restoration. This is a little cartoon that I really like. So I'll go ahead and read it. Is it helpful if I read it, Paul? Probably, because not everybody can see it.
Yes.
It says the first character says, "I've started reading the Bible a little bit every day." And the other guy says, "Do you read it in any certain order?" And he says, "Yeah, I seek out the parts that let me judge others and avoid anything that makes me feel bad." This is that is how he reads the Bible. And he says, "Is there another way to read the Bible?"
Ah,
So that's that I like that one too, because I want to make sure when I read the scriptures that I'm not skipping over something that makes me uncomfortable, right? So, but the part about reading the part that lets me judge others is the part I like to focus on too, because that's unfortunately there's too much of that in the world, right? And the next one is pretty good too. This one says the local carpenter continues to spread disinformation deemed harmful by religious experts, right? And that kind of epitomizes the Old and the New Testament, as well as the Book of Mormon right there. And getting back to Samuel Smith, that's how he was considered as he was going about his missionary work. Now, again, Paul mentioned this website I have called No More Contention. And this is really interesting too, because if the Book of Mormon had been published in the order in which it was translated, this would have been the very first verse. Well, depending on how you treat the last few verses of the Words of Mormon, but because some people think, like I do, that that was actually part of the Book of Mosiah. That's another discussion. But as it's published today, Mosiah 1:1 would have been the first thing Joseph translated that we still have. And the first line says there is no more contention. And I kind of wish that they had published it this way originally, because it would show that the whole Book of Mormon is intended to have no more contention. That's why I like this phrase and have it on my website.
Christopher Thomas.
So
Christopher Thomas emphasizes the murmuring, which appears to be the a basis for contention.
yeah, yeah, and that's because, well, I'm not sure how Chris refer to it, but murmuring tends to be someone who disagrees with someone else, right? So
Right.
you're thinking they're wrong, you should persuade them. It all comes back to this compulsion to persuade someone else to agree with you. Okay, why the rational restoration? This kind of explains those little human personality defects that we just looked at in the cartoons. Because of the fall, our natures have become evil continually, right? And here's another example of this. I like to use these cartoons because they're so succinct at it. This is a Dilbert cartoon. He says, yesterday someone disagreed with me, and I changed his mind using data and reason. And his coworker says, that isn't possible. And Dilbert says, I didn't think so either, but it happened. His coworker says, smells like a trap. And Dilbert says, I couldn't sleep all night. Because, data and reason really don't change people's minds very often. But, and we like to think it does because we think our own opinions are supported by data and reason. But if data and reason changed everyone's mind, we'd all agree. So there's more to it than data and reason. I like this one too. This says, OMG. So Albert Einstein was a real person. All this time, I thought he was a theoretical physicist. That's another reframing that you can see. Someone thought he was a theoretical physicist because he's in so many memes and so on. I thought it was funny because whoever wrote this misspelled theoretical too. But anyway, all right. One more. This is a discourse on life problems. This guy says, life is short. Make sure you spend as much time as possible on the internet arguing with strangers about politics. Right? That gets back to that idea that there's things we can change and things that matter, and we should focus on the intersection. Okay, a few years ago, well, actually a year and a half ago, I think, we were in Ireland, in Belfast. And there's still a wall that goes down through Belfast to separate the Catholics from the Protestants. And there are now gates between there that are open during the day, but they still close them to avoid any of that sectarian violence that went on for so long in Northern Ireland. But I took this picture because it exemplified, with all the graffiti and so on the wall between the Catholics and the Protestants, these two little boys were completely oblivious and they were focused on their social media, right? So to me, that epitomizes the way that we can ignore the noise and contention by focusing on the message of the gospel and by loving, sharing, and inviting. We're responsible for our own faith and actions, not by what's around us. So if I had one single image or painting or photo or anything to depict this idea of ignoring the contention in the world, it would be this one. Okay, now another point about why rational restoration. And I didn't pull up the other version of the Doctrine and Covenants. I didn't have time, Paul, but this is the one that we use. It says, as all have not faith, seek ye diligently and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom. Seek learning even by study and also by faith. So why doesn't that principle prevail throughout the world? And we learn from the Book of Mormon again because of the traditions of their fathers. By the way, that's another Jonathan Edwards phrase, a non-biblical Jonathan Edwards phrase, the traditions of their fathers. Okay, so I'll read this whole thing from Mosiah because it really explains the religious contention in the world. He said, I say to you, my sons, were it not for these things, which, in other words, the scriptures, which have been kept and preserved by the hand of God, that we might read and understand of his mysteries and have his commandments always before our eyes, that even our fathers would have dwindled in unbelief. And we should have been like unto our brethren, the Lamanites, who know nothing concerning these things, and even do not believe them when they are taught them because of the traditions of their fathers, which are not correct. So how do the traditions of our fathers affect us? This is a map of the largest religious denominations and subdivisions around the world. And you can see most religion is regional, right? People embrace the religion that they're taught as children, and they kind of stick with it. This one is from 2nd Nephi, where the Lord said, because ye have a little, referring to the Bible, is you need not suppose that it contains all of my words, neither need ye suppose that I have not caused more to be written. This one is one of the most profound scriptures in the Book of Mormon, I think, because it explains how, well, I'll finish reading it. For I command all men, both in the east and in the west, and in the north and in the south, and in the islands of the sea, that they shall write the words which I speak unto them. For out of the books which shall be written, I will judge the world, every man according to their words, according to that which is written. For behold, I shall speak unto the Jews, and they shall write it, and I shall speak unto the Nephites, and they shall write it, and I shall speak unto the other tribes of the house of Israel, which I have led away, and they shall write it. And I shall also speak unto all nations of the earth, and they shall write it. And to me, that's just a phenomenal explanation of how the Lord works with his children throughout the world. And in some respects, it may be the most significant scripture in the whole Book of Mormon in terms of avoiding contention. And I'll give you one example of many I could give. Years ago, I was doing some work in India, and my host took me to this Swami Waran Ashkardam. It's a Hindu temple outside of New Delhi, and it's a spiritual cultural campus. And here's a picture from the inside of it. And we turned the corner, and they had several dioramas explaining their history. We turned the corner, and here was God appearing to a prophet. And it got in the form of a man, not an elephant and the other things you associate with Hinduism. And I asked my host, I said, well, what is this? And they said, well, God appeared to this man. He became a Swami Waran, is his name. And he started a new sect of Hinduism. He taught people, he brought forth new scriptures. He taught them new agriculture and medical practices. He had disciples, and he's had several successors ever since. And I said, well, when did this all happen? And they said, well, it's around 1820. And I thought, okay, there's an example exactly of what the Book of Mormon said. I shall speak unto all nations of the earth, and they shall write it. And that's what happened in India with this guy. And so that really broadened my horizon about God's influence throughout the world. So that someday that might be another interesting topic to discuss, Paul, but we don't have time tonight. So there's three elements of religion that have been widely recognized. There's belonging, doing, and believing, and those all three kind of interrelate. Some people focus on one or the other, but all three of them are relevant. Here's another one from the Doctrine and Covenants. And even so, I have sent mine everlasting covenant into the world to be a light to the world, to be a standard for my people, and for the Gentiles to seek to it, and to be a messenger before my face to prepare the way before me. Wherefore come ye unto it, and with him that cometh I will reason, as with men in days of old, and I will show you unto you my strong reasoning. And Paul, I think that's kind of what you were alluding to also when you talked about working together in councils and groups, that as we the Lord will show us his strong reasoning when we have that spirit with us. It's amazing, and we all have many examples, I'm sure, of how that happens. It's just another beautiful thing. But I love the way he expressed it as my strong reasoning. That's why it's a rational restoration. Of course, Joseph said we ought to have the building up of Zion as our greatest object. And in my experience, pretty much everyone in the world is seeking a Zion society, but they don't know where to find it. And that's kind of exemplified by this little picture. All these people are seeking a better society, and they want to become better people, and they don't, many of them, in most cases, they don't know how to do it. They don't know where to find the truth. So years ago, my wife and I were teaching in China, and one of my students wrote this to me. He said, human nature is not easy to change, but I really want humanity to be better so that the world would be a better, friendly, happy place. We have experienced so much human ugliness, so we yearn for a better world. And that, I think, is a universal sentiment, certainly among these Chinese students, but among students everywhere, whether Africa, South America, Russia, Ukraine, people on both sides. This is what they're looking for. So how do we do it? Joseph wrote, "It is an imperative duty that we owe to all the rising generation and to all the pure in heart. There are many yet on earth, among all sects, parties, and denominations, who are blinded by the subtle craftiness of men, whereby they lie in wait to deceive, who are only kept from the truth because they know not where to find it. Let no man count them as small things, for there is much which lieth in futurity pertaining to the saints, which depends upon these things. And you know, brethren, that a very large ship is benefited very much by a very small helm in the time of a storm, by being kept workways with the wind and waves." So we might be running short on time, but I want to kind of show my little idea of a small helm, okay, that relates to the rational restoration. And that is what I call the faith model. And the faith model is an acronym for facts, assumptions, inferences, theories, and hypotheses. And what I really like about this, I've tested it many times with a variety of people, and I think it always works. And part of that is that many times what we think are facts are really assumptions or inferences or theories. And so if we can separate what are actual facts from the assumptions theories, then everybody in the world can agree to the facts. And this is, when I say everyone in the world can agree on the facts, most people say that's impossible. We're always disagreeing about facts. And I point, no, we're disagreeing about our assumptions, inferences, and theories, not about the facts. And one simple example I often cite was when Lucy Mack Smith, in the history that she dictated, she said that when Moroni came to Joseph Smith, he told Joseph Smith that first night that the record was in the hill of Cumorah, 3 miles from his house. And that's right in her history. We can all read that. And so some people don't think Cumorah is in New York, and that's fine. But we can all agree to the fact that Lucy Mack Smith said, that's what Moroni said. That's a written fact. We can all read the document. Then we take our assumptions to say, well, she said it after the fact, she incorporated a false tradition, or some people say, well, she was relating exactly what Joseph told her, so the hill Cumorah in New York came from Moroni, etc. But that's where we can all agree to the fact that that is the document, that document exists, and those words are on it. From there, people have a divergent impression or a divergent interpretation based on their assumptions, inferences, and theories. And so I do that with every dispute at this point. And it always comes back to no one is disagreeing about the underlying fact once you isolate it this way. And I've had some interactions with historians, and they say, "Oh, you're talking too much like a lawyer," And I say, "Well, yeah, lawyers have to distinguish between facts and assumptions and theories and so on, but we should all be doing that. Even historians should be doing that." And there's a tendency among historians, including well-known popular historians, who write history and they state their theories as facts, and people read it and they think it's a fact. But it isn't. It's a theory or an assumption or an inference. And so once in a while, I do these peer reviews of various articles and so on. I did one just the other day where I say, okay, you say such and such, and that's a legitimate alternative working hypothesis, but you shouldn't state it as a fact. You should say, I believe, or I conclude, something like that. Don't say this happened, because that confuses readers. They don't understand how historians use that terminology. But so this is my little approach anyway, to completely eliminate contention. And I've given lots of examples of it, but that's what the Rational Restoration talks about in this book. Here's a simple reframe from the Bible. Jesus said, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that you resist not evil. Whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." So Christ very often reframed Old Testament passages. And I have several examples here. I'm going to kind of skip through them because I think, what's our time frame anyway? We've been doing an hour.
Well, we have used our hour, and I don't know that anyone has left.
Okay, well, I'm
Okay,
gonna just, I'm not gonna take the time to go through these other than pass through them because I do have one more I wanted to show and then we can have a conversation.
okay.
So these are all reframes that lead to changes,
Uh-huh.
taking the exact same knowledge and facts, but reframing it. And that's one of the things I'm doing here in France is kind of reframing Christianity so that people who think of Christianity in terms of these massive cathedrals where there's no interaction between the priests and the people and they just sit through mass, trying to reframe that into a new Christianity from the Restoration that we're taught. Division leads to unity, confusion to plainness, tradition to restoration, and so on. A natural man becomes a saint. You know, we know all these things. Okay. Museum of the Book of Mormon, we've talked about before. I'm adding content to there all the time, by the way, Paul. So if people are familiar with that, they might be interested in looking at it because there's, if it involves the Book of Mormon, I try to put it in the museum. And the idea is that people of all faiths can find inspiration and spiritual truth in the Book of Mormon, regardless of whether they are baptized in any church or whatever. Everyone, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, they can all find inspiration and spiritual truth in the Book of Mormon. It's a universal gift from God to inspire people. Of course, bring them to Christ, but here's some of the web pages we mentioned. Okay. I'll tell you what, I'll stop here because in case people have questions, and I could, as you can tell, I could keep talking forever. But this one I wanted to point out because Rough Stone Rolling was one of these books I mentioned where Richard Bushman stated a lot of theories as facts. And so I went through his chapter on the translation, for example, and in the MOBOM, the Museum of the Book of Mormon, I have a line by line analysis of his chapter. I can send you the link, Paul, if you want to share it. But in that chapter, I show how many times what he stated, he framed it as a fact, but it was really just a theory. And I said, I suggested a better way to write it. Well, and it partly in response to that, and in response to my other books, Richard's most recent book is called Joseph Smith's Gold Plates. And in there, he acknowledges alternative points of view, partly by quoting me several times about the two sets of plates in the Jonathan Edwards material. He loves the Jonathan Edwards stuff because his first two professional publications were on Jonathan Edwards. He was an expert in early American Christian history, and he loved Jonathan Edwards. And he told me when they started the Joseph Smith Papers project, they brought in the experts from Yale on the Jonathan Edwards papers because of the way they had cataloged it and digitized it and so on. And one of them is still on the board of the Joseph Smith papers. But he said, I should have been around here 15 years earlier because at the time they were trying to figure out a way to integrate Jonathan Edwards and Joseph Smith, and they didn't see it. And he says, well, now you've made it obvious for everybody. So he introduced me to the people at Yale, and I had to explain to them that there's some problems in their database where they've omitted some of Edwards' works, and so they're working on revising that. Anyway, it's been a real interesting thing. But the point of this, showing this slide, is that even Richard Bushman has recognized that there's a lot of different ways to reframe the history that he had written about and is known throughout the world, really, as the biography of Joseph Smith. So, all right, we don't have time to go through other reframes, but there's lots of them in the book if you're interested, and we could talk about those or any other questions people have.
Well, thank you.
Says,
As host, I get the privilege of the first question, and so I'm going to, of course, jump in on that. Actually, I want to get a couple of comments in. For one, in the reframing, I find that so consonant with what my sweetheart said to me when she came back 2 months after she passed. No, it was the day before Christmas. She died February 28th, and she came back on the day before Christmas to say, tell the family to enroll in the spiritual university. That's the direction that you're headed. And she said the portal to joy is always open from her perspective. from eternity, but we slam it shut by getting angry, by misrepresenting, by lying, or by following traditions that don't lead us to the right place.
Mhm.
So that back to your father's traditions there that
Yeah.
she came back to emphasize for me. And wow, that but I want to go back also to your point about the universality of the gospel. For I just
Mhm.
finished a course on the great religions, and I found over 3 dozen references, that is, statements of the golden rule across the
Mhm.
great religions and the great philosophers. 3 dozen different statements of the golden rule. It is such a basic, fundamental gospel principle to treat each
Mhm.
other with compassion, and it's so beautifully stated in so many different ways when you start digging into it. And so I again find that just to be an intriguing demonstration that Christ went to the other sheep. God was
Mhm.
God was interested in letting up other people. You mentioned the gentleman in India. At the same time, we have the Bab who gave the revelations for the founding of Baha'i. In,
Mhm. That's
and,
right.
and so here you are with another 1840s prophet who is speaking the word of God,
Mhm.
encouraging people to see the commonalities among several religions, which ended up getting a whole bunch of people murdered.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think that passage from the Book of Mormon is so profound, because I'm not aware of any other sacred book that says God speaks to everybody, and they write it, and it's for them, most of the religious books, even including the Bible, say we are the chosen people and we're the only ones God speaks to, right? But the Book of Mormon was explicit that God speaks to everybody and has them write it. It's fantastic. I just love
That's
it.
a marvelous message. You mentioned the pilgrimages, and I want to get a question in there, and then I'll yield to other people. But when I was in Mexico, I saw women on their knees walking toward the Virgin of Guadalupe Cathedral, leaving a trail of blood behind because they had walked a mile on their knees to make a special
Mhm.
petition. Is that the kind of thing that you see in France as well?
Well, I haven't seen that here. There's, of course, people kneel when they go in the cathedrals, but the pilgrimages we've seen are people just walking. There's Saint Jacques, I think, that walked all the way to northern Spain, through France. They follow that pilgrimage. I've seen those kind of things in Jerusalem. You see people walking on their knees, but I haven't seen that in France.
Mm.
Although we haven't been all over either, but so people may be doing that here too.
All right, I yield to the other people.
Ron, did you have, yeah, Ron Smith, go ahead.
Um, can you hear me okay? I've got an air conditioner on in here.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
All right.
sounds good.
Um, I was I really appreciated the faith acronym. I had a colleague at Graceland who explained, he was in biology, Larry Euler, and he explained facts as reported observations. And he said, if you look at facts as reported observations, then one of the most interesting questions about them is whether or not they're true. But it 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 was like you said, if the fact is that we have a document that has those words in it, and we can agree if we if a fact is a reported observation, and then the theories are the stories that we tell ourselves to make the facts make sense to us.
Right.
And so anyway, I just I appreciated the the faith acronym that you had, and a couple of other things that you said as well, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me mention something about that faith acronym. So obviously that doesn't translate into French, right?
Right.
So I went on Grok and I said, okay, here's my faith acronym. Can you give me something similar in French? And it did. It was amazing. It came up with croire, which is the French word for believe, but it's instead of 5 letters, it's 6 letters. So it added a little more nuance on one of the things. But that's how I'm translating it now with this different acronym in French that works just as well. And I never would have come up with it on my own. And in fact, I have a translator, because usually when I do translation, I use AI now. And I just do a quick translation in 5 minutes of an entire book. And then I have a French translator who goes through it. And the French translator was kind of stymied by that acronym also, the faith acronym. How do we put this into French? You know, we're trying to think of, first I tried to think of a French word that started with F, and I said, well, wait a minute, faith doesn't mean anything in French. So so it was an interesting process to go through. But once Grok gave us this new acronym, the people I've showed it to said, oh, that's awesome. I've never seen that before, And so it's amazing how it works, but the concept is the same, just like you pointed out, it's an observable thing. We can all observe it. And we know we can all agree that X exists because we can see it, touch it, etc. But then we real quickly devolve into our assumptions and inferences and so on. And that's why we have differences of opinion about the meaning of the fact. Yeah, good point.
Hey, Terry Walker, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. I have a question and a comment. The first question is, when were you on your mission in France?
Okay, it was 50 years ago, so 73 to 5.
Okay, I was in there 69 through part of 71. There were chapels in Nice and Marseille at that time. And I don't remember if they were the only ones in France then or not. If there was one in the Paris area, I can't remember. But those would have been 2 of the first 3 chapels in France.
Okay, that's good. One of the things we're doing is getting from the building department the history of every chapel, because there's no resource for that right now. And those 2 cities weren't in my mission, so I didn't know about those at the time. But we have visited them since. So good.
And the second, it's a comment on being a lawyer. I'm sure you understand that facts in a courtroom aren't based necessarily on facts, but on presentation. And that I think that holds very true in religious, conversion and whatnot. But anyway.
Yeah, I recently did a blog post about how what we call fact finding in court isn't really fact finding. It's just trying to persuade someone of a point of view. And it's a misnomer in the legal world to call the judge or a jury the fact finders, because they're not really finding facts. They're just trying to figure out which version of reality is the more plausible based on the requirements, the burden of proof and so on. So that's a good point. But I did do a blog post on that because it came up in a conversation that I had too. Good one. By the way, the legal system in France is quite different. It's a civil law system instead of common law. And so the judges in most cases are the fact finders, not the juries here.
Right.
So,
and the only place in the United States that's true is Louisiana, right?
Yeah, and even in Louisiana,
on English law, they're based on French law.
Yeah, it's not common law, it's civil law. But even in Louisiana, they've adapted it to be more like the other states at this point. It's quite different here in France. There would have been probably a lot more questions if I had gotten through more examples, like the Hill Cumorah example is one that we've discussed here before about, is the Hill Cumorah really in New York, or is it in Central America or South America, or other places in the world? A lot of usually when I talk about the translation issue, people bring up the stone in the hat versus the Urim and Thummim. But there's a lot of other aspects of church history that I've done reframes for in here that I don't know if I could pull them up if you wanted, Paul, but
I would like for you to show some of your artwork. That's something that you suggested that we can come back to at the end, and I think people would like to appreciate that.
Oh, I didn't think you'd take me seriously. No, actually, so I have a couple pieces here. They're not really finished, but here's a little one I did, just a little watercolor to give you an idea. You can see that.
Hmm.
It's not framed or anything, but that's a real, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a real common sight here in France to see these stone walls with the roses climbing up.
Yeah, we can see it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, that's just a little watercolor. I have another one drying out here that's not really completely finished, but at least it gives you an idea. This is
Oh,
that
that's that
church I
church.
showed you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the same.
It's really good when your art can be recognized.
That's a good point. Let's see, I don't know, I have several sitting over here. Here's one of a countryside that I haven't finished, but it's rough. But I'm redoing the sky a little bit, but you can see the bales of hay here. And now in France, they have these, maybe you can't see them, they're kind of small on the screen, but
What,
they roll them up like they do in America, of course. And so I've thought about doing a series on bales of hay like Monet did with the stack of hay, all the different lighting, only doing it with these roller hay. I have another one on my easel that is, I did just the first layer, just to give you an idea. This is a French village by the lake. So you can kind of see that. That one's obviously first stage. I don't know, I have some around here somewhere else.
all right, let me then go to the future, because with the Book of Mormon perspectives as well, a part of the background of the bicentennial for the Book of Mormon coming up in 2030 in Lamoni, Iowa, by the way, I would anticipate that what you shared tonight is, well, it could very well be part of the presentation that you're preparing for that.
I haven't specifically prepared anything for that yet. Haven't
Oh, no,
even
I
thought
don't
that
expect
far.
I'm suggesting that I think that what you're sharing tonight about the
Yeah,
universality
I
of the Book
get
of
it.
Mormon,
Yeah,
is something that belongs in that bicentennial appreciation.
sure. I'd love to be part of it. Wait, let's see. Yeah, I'll be back in about a year. So
Well, we
yeah, it'd
have
be awesome.
5 years to prepare. Um, the steering committee is forming, and excitement is building. The time is having to expand because we have people like Josh Gailey, who wants to make sure there's time for his kids to can come and sing, and they want people want to celebrate. 200
Sure.
years of the Book of Mormon is worth a celebration, and to do it at Lamoni, which has its name in the Book of Mormon, is
Hmm.
altogether appropriate, I think. And so that's in the process of now being designed. At the end of this month, we'll have a session with people having a chance to have their input on the planning for that bicentennial celebration.
That sounds fantastic. Sure, I'd love to be part of it. So if you'd like, I could take, well, I don't, it's getting late probably.
Yeah,
I don't even,
it's
I've lost time.
it's
And
4:30.
I have the whole thing on Lucy Mack Smith and the Cumorah thing and how you go through the different steps, but we don't need to do that. I think everybody got that idea. But for me, it's pretty cool because whenever I talk with people about this Cumorah issue, usually they don't know about Lucy Mack Smith's history. And no one ever cites it or quotes it, except for me, I guess. Because to me, it's, it's pretty obvious. It was Moroni who called the hill Cumorah, you know. And that's why I wrote that book about Cumorah and how it fits with the geography and the history and everything else. But it starts with the real basic, simple early church history for me. And then you try to figure out how does the text explain it and how does the archaeology and anthropology and so on. So that's one of my favorite examples. But
Blair has a question and or comment. Hello, Blair. You're muted. There you are.
I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are.
Jonathan, I want to know from you're the LDS side, and I'm from the Community of Christ side.
Mhm.
I keep hearing about the plates of Lehi,
Mhm.
and I don't find anything in the Book of Mormon that speaks of the plates of Lehi, and I don't know where that is or what it comes from. Have you got an idea that you showed that picture of different kinds of plates, and it doesn't quite match up with my understanding, but what do you see about the plates of Lehi?
Yeah, it comes from the preface in the 1830 edition, which I don't have in front of me right here, right now. But if you have an 1830 edition, Joseph wrote a preface in there. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Let me see. I should have it online here if I can find it. Might take a sec.
You leaving, Carol? Have a good night.
Well, thanks for showing us your deer, Carol.
Okay, so this is in the preface, which was only in the 1830 edition. Joseph took it out in the subsequent editions, even the ones he edited. But he said, I would inform you that I translated by the gift and power of God and caused to be written 116 pages, which I took from the Book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon. That's where that comes from. So if you have an 1830 edition, you can read that in the preface.
Well, I've got the facsimile of the 1830 edition.
Okay. Well, that's fair. It should be right in the preface, right at the beginning.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
From the Community of Christ, I have understood that the Book of Mormon was forbidden in France, and you have showed me that there are all sorts of variations of Book of Mormon in France, and I don't know where this comes from. Does anybody else know about the Community of Christ and why they say that, or why I understand that it has been said that the Book of Mormon is not allowed in France?
Well, as a historian, I can tell you some background on that. So Bertrand was a Welsh convert who came. He was the first missionary to come to France, and of course he faced lots of opposition, and everybody ignored him. He couldn't even speak French. He didn't have a Book of Mormon. So he went back to Wales and then brought his, I think she was 11 years old, his daughter with him. And because she could learn French and he couldn't. So she became his missionary companion. And she had just a handful of pamphlets. And she would go down the street, hand them to each of the people and say, I'm coming back in a few days to get these because these are the only ones I have. And so she would revisit each house and pick up the pamphlets and go to the next house. So the two of them are the first missionaries here in France, but they still didn't have a French edition. So John Taylor came over from England, and he's credited with translating the Book of Mormon into French, but he didn't know French. But he had another guy who had been baptized here who translated into French. But John Taylor got in a lot of trouble here in France. He was interacting with Napoleon and the various royalty over here, and they didn't like John Taylor coming over here saying that the kingdom of God was going to destroy all the kingdoms of the earth. And so he was exiled from France, and he was in hiding for a long time in northern France, and finally they found him and exiled him to Guernsey, where he met Victor Hugo and so on. But for a long time, the church was, anything having to do with the Book of Mormon was banished from France because of the threat to the kingdom, the king and the royalty. And that was kind of the downside of preaching the end of the kingdoms of the earth. you know. But after the revolution, that was no longer an issue. So in the early days, the French royalty banished the Book of Mormon, but after that, after the revolution, missionaries came over here and people started joining the church and so on. So that's probably the genesis of what you were talking about.
I see. But that's ancient history.
Yeah, it's ancient history to us. To the French, it's recent history. Because, for their history goes back several thousand years. So to them, the revolution was yesterday. And in fact, they at the time during the revolution, they tore down a lot of the churches and the chateaus and so on. And people are still going around restoring some of the chateaus and churches that were destroyed during the revolution. So it is an ancient history to them here.
Yeah, I understand. Europe has a different idea about how old things are. Anything that's
Yeah,
100 years old here is ancient history.
right, exactly.
It's fresh over there.
Well, and in fact, here's another example. They had the religion wars. Well, we've been to places that the British attacked over 1,000 years ago, so this has been going on a long time.
Oh, yeah.
But we visited a little city where the Protestants were surrounded by the Catholics, because the Catholics at one point were trying to eradicate Protestantism here. And the little town was called Allemagne en Provence, which means Germany in Provence. There actually were two towns in France named Allemagne, which is the French word for Germany. And so in Allemagne en Provence, there were a bunch of Protestants, and the Catholics from the nearby town surrounded it and laid siege to the town because the Duke was gone. So his wife withheld the siege for about 2 weeks until her husband came back. And then the Protestants surrounded the Catholics, and most of the Catholics escaped. Some of them remained or were captured. And on the last day of the battle, the Duke was killed, and his wife was so furious that she slit the throats of the captives, all but 12 of them. And those 12 she kept alive until her husband was buried, and then she killed all 12 of those on top of her husband's grave. So that's how they dealt with Catholics here in France back in the day. But so there's this long history of religion wars here, which explains why so many people in France are disillusioned with religion.
Okay. Enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much.
And I should mention too, of the two cities that were named Allemagne, one of them changed its name after World War II, but the other still today is called Allemagne en Provence. So just interesting details.
Yeah, I was in Germany for 15 years working for the Army. And
Okay.
so I got a sense of that tension, Catholic Protestantism, Northern and Southern Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Terry,
So
go
Terry,
ahead.
you got your
When I was in Lausanne, I met the man who was the one who translated the current Book of Mormon in France. Then I don't remember his name, but it was an
okay.
interesting experience because my companion had to speak in sacrament meetings. So he went to him to help him do his talks because he wanted it done perfectly in French. And I was just sitting in the other room while that was going on. But he had some issues with some of the things in the Book of Mormon that the church was doing. And so he wasn't very active. But and that would have been in 1970, late 1970.
You know what?
Okay.
That's the kind of thing that we're doing these oral histories, and that's the kind of anecdote that would be very helpful to us. So could you actually email me and I'll talk to you about that a little bit. That's kind of that little detail that's fun to fill in the history, because one of our things is talking about the translation of the Book of Mormon, of course,
Okay.
and who was involved and so on. One time I was doing a presentation over here, and people were asking me about the Book of Mormon geography, and I said, well, the only thing they built with stone in the text was they mentioned stone walls, and someone said, no, they had big stone cities, and I said, where does it say that? And they pointed to me to the French translation, and it turns out the translator did translate it that way. So I had to say, well, it doesn't say that in English. There's an example of a bad translation because the guy had Mesoamerica in mind when he translated the Book of Mormon into French. And so he was translating passages kind of along what I call the Sorensen translation, where John Sorensen would add terminology to make it fit. And so I said, well, I can't help you with that. All I can say is that in English, the way Joseph Smith translated it, it doesn't say that, So that's an ongoing issue all the time. But no, that's an interesting anecdote that I would like to include. So yeah, send it to me.
I'll see if I can find it. I don't know. I haven't had much communication with anybody that I knew on my mission, but I'll see if I can find something of, especially those who were in Lausanne at the time, if they can remember who that was.
Yeah. Well, if you can even that note that he helped your companion translate his talk, that's a cool little anecdote. If you have the time or the date at least and the people involved, that's a fun thing for us to throw in the history. Those are the kind of anecdotes and stories that we're hearing all the time over here that have never been documented, that kind of flesh out what happened here. So, and we wish we had a lot more of those from Joseph and Oliver, don't we? Okay, good. Well, it's been fun being with you.
Let me thank you, Jonathan. It's I think
Sure.
4:40 in the morning for you at this stage, if I have the
Yeah.
calculations right. And so that's an extraordinary contribution on your part. I like to be asleep at that time of the day, and here you are entertaining an international gathering. So thank you so much for doing that. And
Happy to.
let me again appreciate the fact that you've been able to give numerous presentations on the forum over the 5 years we've been going, and I would like to invite you back for many more because it's clear that we all benefit from it. And so,
Happy to, whenever we can. It's better when I'm in the States, though, I have to admit.
oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, Blair has another hand up.
Okay.
I would like to tell people about next week.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to be giving a presentation. It is already made. Paul's got it ready to send it out. He or Robert, I don't know which one will do it, but it's prepared. And I will be here to answer questions. It's about the reading, the interpretation of the character's transcript, and one complete sentence is translated. And I want to show you how I got to that point of interpreting that information in that one sentence. So welcome you all. Come back next week.
Well, and because Blair has spent over 30 years studying this manuscript and has come up with the details of the radicals are there, but then they have the modifications, and he's gotten in both the radicals and the modifications to gain a marvelous understanding. I definitely encourage you to come participate next week. The character's transcript is clearly one of the most fascinating elements of our Book of Mormon history.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you again,
Yeah.
Jonathan. It's been delightful
Sure.
to have you with us. Thank you for sacrificing your sleep.
No problem. Okay. See you next time.
Good night. Are we not honored to have this kind of presentation? Wow, it just amazes me that we have such excellent scholarship available to us.